Miter saw, maker of the... Wait, that didn't sound right.
Micro Jig, maker of the gripper. Work safer, work smarter.
A miter saw, sometimes called a chop saw or even a mitra saw in England, is often the first semi-stationary tool that new woodworkers purchase. With a miter saw, you can make repeated cuts all the same length as well as cut accurate miters or angles. Unlike a table saw or a bandsaw, when using a miter saw, your board remains stationary while the blade moves through it. This means the length of your cut is limited to the diameter of the blade. For this reason, a miter saw is primarily used for cross-cutting, cutting a board to length across the grain. Although a table saw can also make these cuts, it's handy to own both tools because there's really no quicker or easier way to make cross-cuts than with a miter saw. The blade of a miter saw is attached to a head that swings down to make the cut. When not in use, a spring holds the saw in an upright position. A blade guard covers the blade and automatically retracts when making a cut. In addition to protecting your hands from injury, the blade guard helps direct sawdust to the rear dust chute and into a bag or a vacuum. Never use a miter saw without this blade guard in place. Your workpiece rests on the table and is held against the fence, which has a split to allow the blade to pass through. Some saws have a clamp to help keep your board from moving. The front of the blade spins downward and towards the rear of the saw as it cuts into the wood. At the front of the table is a miter adjustment. This rotates the saw head to create angles up to 45 degrees in relation to the fence. Some saws pivot in both directions, others just one. In addition to pivoting at an angle, a compound miter saw has a head that tilts to create bevels. Most saws sold today are compound miter saws. On the handle is an on-off power switch that turns the saw on while you squeeze it and stops when you release it. In the United States, miter saws are commonly available in 3 sizes based on their cut capacities and measured by their blade diameters: 7.5 inch, 10 inch, and 12 inch. Both 10 inch and 12 inch saws have merit. This 10 inch saw will handle most of the cuts I need to make, but there are times when having a big 12 inch saw is handy. However, sliding miter saws are more affordable than ever, and a 10 inch sliding miter saw isn't a bad choice. One thing to consider is the cost of blades. 12 inch blades are pretty expensive. I don't recommend a 7.5 inch saw. It's mainly used for cutting molding or plumbing pipes, and its cut capacity is just too small for most woodworking applications. The head of a sliding miter saw slides along a rail to allow you to cut boards wider than the diameter of the saw blade. I can only show you pictures because I've never owned one. Very wide boards aren't typically used in woodworking projects, and if I do need to crosscut one, I could use my table saw. Overall, my recommendation for a weekend woodworker is a 10 inch non-sliding compound miter saw. It gives you the most bang for your buck. A miter saw has less risk for potential injury than, say, a table saw, but it still demands the same level of respect and awareness during every cut. Unplug the saw before changing the blade. Never use a miter saw without the blade guard. Use a clamp to hold your workpiece in place whenever possible. Before each cut, make an imaginary cut, positioning your hands and body where they will be during the actual cut. Make sure you aren't in some weird, awkward position, and double check that your hand will be far from the blade as it pivots down. Always make sure your workpiece is positioned against the fence before you make the cut. When making a cut, squeeze the power trigger and let the saw rev up to its full speed before pulling the head down. Ease the blade gently into the wood and slice it all the way through. Release the power trigger and let the saw come to a complete stop before raising it back up. Time for some real talk, just you and me. In the real world, when we're cutting a lot of boards, we won't always let the saw come to a complete stop before lifting the blade. In fact, that's probably the exception. While I certainly advise you not to do so, For most cuts, if you do lift the head while the saw is still spinning, you'll probably be okay. But one time you should definitely follow this rule is when using a stop block, especially when cutting small pieces. With a stop block, the cutoff piece is trapped between the blade and the block. If you raise the blade while it's still spinning, it's possible that the cutoff piece of wood can shift a little and the edge of a sawtooth might snag it. If this happens, it can lift the piece of wood and throw it in a random direction. This is a real thing. It has happened to me, and when it happens, it's loud and it's scary. Despite its name, the most common cut you'll make with a miter saw is a crosscut. Home centers and lumber yards sell a variety of boards at different widths. And there's a lot of things you can make with dimensional lumber where you won't need to make any rip cuts. I'll include some projects down in the description that don't require a table saw. These are great projects to start with. To make a crosscut, draw a line where you need to cut your wood, then press the board up against the fence. Move the workpiece side to side a little until one edge of your cut line is lined up perfectly with the teeth of the saw blade. As with any other saw cut, never cut down the middle of the line. Always pick one side or the other, depending on which side is your keeper piece. And it's also a good idea to clamp the workpiece in place to prevent it from moving. With your left hand well away from the blade, make an imaginary cut by pulling the head down until it touches the wood. That'll let you double check that your saw will cut where you want it to, but more importantly, act as a dry run, setting up where your hands will be throughout the cut. Once you're happy with where everything is and the head is in its full upright position, squeeze the power trigger and gently lower the saw all the way down through the wood until the head stops. With the saw in this fully down position, release the trigger and wait for the saw to come to a complete stop before raising the head back up. You can cut boards with their faces down or on their edges. I think you get a more accurate cut with the board face down though. If your saw is, say, slightly out of square to your table, it won't be as obvious since it's only going through the 3/4 inch thickness of the board. But if the board is on its edge, any slightly skewed angle of your saw will be much more apparent. A lot of times you need to cut multiple parts for a project all the same length. Measuring out each piece with a tape measure would not only get tedious, but your results would be inconsistent. I guarantee none of their lengths would match. Instead, get a scrap of wood and clamp it to your fence where you want to make the length of your cut. Measure from the edge of your saw blade with the head locked down. Make stop blocks a routine part of using your miter saw. The tables of miter saws are pretty small, and if you're cutting long boards, it's a good idea to support the end that hangs over. I usually just stack a couple of 2x4s under it. It's not uncommon to need to set up a stop block for boards longer than your fence allows. To do this, just grab a straight board or even a strip of plywood and screw it right onto the saw's factory fence. There's holes in the back of the fence just for this. Use 4 screws, 2 on each side of the saw. Make sure that they're short enough that they don't poke through the board. Now make a cut through the fence. One nice thing about making this auxiliary fence is that the split is a 0 clearance slot, making it really easy to measure for stop blocks. Just clip the end of your tape measure in the slot and measure. Make a mark on the fence and clamp the stop block in place. Cutting miters really isn't that much different than making cross cuts. It's just that your blade is angled. Most saws will pivot in both directions, but I pivot my saw to the right almost all the time. All saws will have a gauge to indicate the angle you want to make. common angles will usually have a positive stop so that you can lock them and know that they will be accurate. This is, of course, assuming you've calibrated your saw. Your instruction manual will show you how to do that. Most of the miters I make are 45 degrees since they're useful for picture frames or boxes or anything else with right angles. By pivoting the saw to the right, you'll be able to easily see the cut, and I feel that it's a little safer since the saw is cutting away from your left hand. I don't like not being able to see the entire operation when cutting to the left. A bevel is an angled cut made along the edge or the end of a board. Since a miter saw can't cut along the edge of a board, bevels are only for angling the ends. There are two ways to make a bevel cut on a miter saw. The easiest method is just to stand the board up on its edge and pivot the saw, just like making any other miter cut. Probably a more accurate method is to use the bevel feature of your miter saw. To do this, there'll be a mechanism to unlock the head and let you tip it to the side. There's a scale that'll show you the angle of the bevel. Place the face of your board against the table and squeeze the power trigger and slowly bring the saw through the wood. Pay special attention to your left hand when making bevels because much of the cut can be blind. One of the things you can do with a compound miter saw is, wait for it, make compound miters. These are cuts that combine a bevel and a miter. Mostly these are used for fitting together certain trim moldings and are beyond the scope of this basics video. They can be tricky to make correctly, and to be honest, I've only had to cut a handful of compound miters in my life. And those are the basics you need to know to get started using a miter saw. Hey, if you found this video helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you'd stick around for 1 minute longer to learn about this week's sponsor, Thumbtack. And then I'll be back at the end of this video with a few more words on miter saws. Hey everybody, I'm really happy to have Thumbtack back as this week's sponsor. When I introduced you to Thumbtack, I told you of my plans to hire a local professional to concrete in this side of my driveway and along the side of my shop. There's my shop window right there. The contractors who came out to the house really knew what they were doing and gave us next day estimates. Now it's on us. If our finances can swing it, we're going to proceed with this project this fall. Thumbtack is a really cool service available in all 50 states and offers more than 1,000 different services. And as much as I would like to do my yard work myself, I've realized that I simply no longer have the time. So we're gonna hire a gardener to clean up this overgrown jungle. Using Thumbtack is simple. Just fill out the form on thumbtack.com describing exactly what you need done. Then local professionals review your request and put together custom quotes. Download the app or try it now at thumbtack.com. And I want to thank Thumbtack again for sponsoring this week's episode. Hey, thanks for sticking around till the end. Like I mentioned at the beginning, you can make all these cuts using a table saw, but they're faster and easier with a miter saw. Plus, a 10-inch saw like this one is lightweight, fairly inexpensive, and it takes up very little space. The first project in my upcoming course, The Weekend Woodworker, makes extensive use of the miter saw. If you'd like to be informed when the course launches, be sure to sign up for the Woodworking for Mere Mortals newsletter. There's a link down in the description. And if you like these basics videos, check out the entire series. Tons of information to get you started. Thanks for watching, everybody.